Hello everyone, this is Professor DiPaolo welcoming you back to Site 265 online, and today we're going to be talking about multi-group design. So multi-group design is having three or more levels of your independent variable or three or more groups. Now previously we talked about the two-group design where you have a treatment group and you have a control group, and you hypothesize that a treatment group would do better than a control group. Sometimes it's better to have more than two groups. So you can have more than one treatment group. For instance, you could have the treatment group that gets a high dosage of a drug, and then a medium dosage of the drug, and then a placebo. That would be three groups. Or you can have four groups where you get a high dose of the drug, a medium dose of the drug, a low dose of the drug, and then a placebo. And this allows us to draw more, I guess, more nuanced conclusions about the effect of the independent variable. So it's not either a yes or no answer that you have with a two-group design. Yes, does your treatment work? Or no, it doesn't. Here you have, does it work on a certain scale? Or is it better to have more of the treatment than less of the treatment versus the placebo? So there are a lot of advantages for using more than two groups or two levels of the independent variable. So for example, how would you improve students' grades? You can have a situation where students will study in a large group versus studying in a small group versus studying alone. That's three levels or three groups, three levels of the independent variable. So you have large, small, and alone. Those are your three levels. And that tells you more about studying than just doing group versus studying alone, right? Because it might be very effective to study in a small group. It might be much more effective to do that than study alone. But then if you study in a large group, maybe it's not as effective because there's more distractions. So you would be able to answer this question in a more nuanced way, come up with a more specific answer by using a three groups or three levels of independent variable design, rather than the classic two-group design. What's the best stress reduction technique? Of course, if you've been listening to my videos, I always talk about my research involving stress reduction, which is usually meditation or stress management. You can do this a variety of ways. You could have meditation versus yoga versus exercise. Those are three conditions. Those are three groups. So in my study, I did meditation versus stress management. So I only had two levels. But if I had the ability to extend it to three levels, I would have. The problem is, obviously if you extend it to three levels, you need more participants. You need someone to run that third group, costs more money, takes more time, etc. Sometimes it's not viable, but if you can run three or more groups, it's something that you want to look at, right? So in one study, I actually did run three groups. So I did meditation versus stress management, and then I had a third group, which was the toning group, where people made different tones throughout the session. And we wanted to compare this toning. Is it better than meditation? Is it worse than meditation? Is it better than stress management? And we could do this with the three groups. That was one specific study I ran with the three groups. Similar to this one here, the example I'm giving you, meditation versus yoga versus exercise. I mean, I think meditation is great, but some people might prefer yoga. And then yet other people might just like to go for a run. These are all good things to do. These are all beneficial. Which one is better than the other, relatively speaking? That's what the question we're asking here. What's the best treatment for an adolescent with depression? Would it be pills, antidepressants? Would it be therapy? Or you can actually add different types of therapy. So you can give one group medication, one group therapy, and the third group can get both, medication and therapy. You can make like a combination group. Or you can run one group as getting medication, a second group as getting therapy, cognitive therapy. The third group could get psychodynamic therapy or psychoanalytic therapy. And then you can make comparisons that way. So there's a wide variety of ways to make this work. And it's a really effective design. They're pretty easy to run. Yes, it does take more time, costs more money, You need more participants with 3 groups than 2 groups. And if you keep adding groups, it gets a little bit more murkier in terms of what comparisons you're making. But this is a design that's very common, used often. People do this all the time, and it's a very effective design. So in the case of the depression one, therapy versus medication versus placebo, or therapy versus medication versus combined therapy and medication. So you can do this whatever way you want and see the effectiveness of the study. Now, there's a debate whether you should include a no treatment baseline condition. A no treatment baseline condition is where you have the absence of the treatment completely. So this is a placebo group. And this is a very effective in a drug study to run a placebo group. It's a little bit harder in a non-drug study to run a placebo group generally because we're not really comparing it to doing nothing. We're comparing it to something that is normally done. For example, in my meditation studies, I don't like to talk too much about this, but it's a good example. I had my control group be the stress management group. So I gave the people in the stress management group 10 weeks of training doing some basic stress management techniques like journaling, like gratitude lists, etc. So they did that for 10 weeks. The people in the treatment group got the meditation for 10 weeks. Now, in that study that I ran, I don't have a no treatment baseline condition. So I don't have a placebo condition per se. Because the people in the stress management group, they're getting something better than basically doing nothing. I didn't want them to do nothing for 10 weeks. I want them to get some benefit. And I also wanted to show that meditation is superior to stress management. Because everybody knows about stress management. You have stress management courses at the college. If you go online, you find stress management techniques, advice everywhere. So everybody's kind of familiar with that. And I wanted to see, is meditation that much superior to the basic stress management that everybody does? And I showed that. It was vastly superior to stress management. If you're running a drug study, you want to have a placebo because the placebo is kind of what the patient or the participant in your study expects to happen. So the act of like taking a pill and actually believing that it's the real treatment has a very big effect on the outcome, on the dependent variable, on the behavior you're measuring. For example, if you're studying depression and you give someone a placebo and they're convinced that they're getting the real drug, right? You don't tell them, oh, this is a placebo, you're not going to feel anything. No, you're convinced when you give it to them, and they're convinced when they take it that it's a real drug, right? This is what's called a double-blind study. So the researcher is blind to what treatment they're giving, and the participant is blind to what treatment they're receiving. So they both think they're getting the real drug, but instead they're getting the placebo. And just the fact that that patient thinks they're getting the real drug will create a placebo effect. So placebo effect is the expectation to get better because you think you're taking the real medication. That's the placebo effect. And it's very big when it comes to antidepressants or taking medication for even pain management. If you give someone a placebo for pain management, they're going to get better because they think they're getting the real drug, and that mindset is going to improve their condition. Now, the drug should be better than the placebo, right? So getting the real drug should actually improve their condition more than thinking they're getting the real drug, but instead getting, a placebo. But there is a pretty big placebo effect in drug studies. And that's why you always want to compare a new treatment or a new drug to a placebo to make sure it's better than that placebo. So it's not just a psychological expectation to get better, it's actually a real treatment. It's actually a real difference in getting better with the real drug, that is. So in other psychological research, it's not as common because you don't have the same expectation of a placebo condition or a no treatment condition. In my meditation study, if you didn't get the meditation, I didn't want to give you nothing. So here, go home for 10 weeks and do nothing. Because the participant doesn't expect to get better that way. So there's going to be no placebo effect there, right? So running that baseline no treatment condition in my study personally wouldn't be as effective. Now, some studies will do that. They'll say, okay, you're going to be in the meditation group, but you have to wait a while. So you're going to have to wait 10 weeks. And it's called a wait list condition, where they go home and they think they're going to be in the condition, but they never get the call. They never get that phone call to say, hey, you're in the study. And so they're basically doing nothing for those 10 weeks. I don't really find that a helpful comparison. So when it comes to the needs of a placebo, I would say yes, for a drug study, it's very important because the placebo effect is very strong in a drug study. Outside of the drug study conditions, right, the placebo effect is going to be minimal, especially if the person thinks they're getting nothing. They're just waiting around doing no, or go watch TV for 10 weeks. Or go read a book for 10 weeks. That's not going to do much. So in my study, I wanted to have a comparison condition that is typical of what most people do, and that is stress management, right? Most people are familiar with that, and they've done some of this in their past on their own or with professionals, like therapists, etc. And this is kind of a more realistic comparison to say, is meditation better than stress management? With a drug study, you definitely want to use a placebo, though. So as I mentioned before, placebo effect is the effect of your expectation to get better. So if you take that drug, if you take that placebo, you think it's the real drug, and you think you're going to get better. And just thinking you're going to get better actually makes you improve. So if I gave you a placebo and I told you this is a new antidepressant and you took it, you would probably say, I feel better. It's really working. And another way we know that the placebo effect is a very potent effect is that people report side effects. So they're like, say, oh, I feel better, but I have a headache from the medication. Or I feel better, but I'm having nausea from the medication. But in fact, the medication is a placebo. It's a sugar pill. So the fact that they're having side effects, on top of the fact that they say they improve, shows you how potent the placebo effect can really be and how we have to use that as a control in any kind of drug study. We also want to use multiple methods. This is called methodological pluralism. Excuse me. If we use multiple methods to answer a research question, we have more confidence in the answer. So that means if you want to do surveys, that's great. Do a survey, but then maybe do an interview on top of that, right? So you're using two different methodologies. And if you get the same results with those two different methodologies, you're more confident in the data. You're more confident that your research question is being answered. So I always like to try to use, if possible, multiple methods. Could be descriptive data, could be survey data, could be experimental data. The more different methods you use, the more confident you are in the answer. So run that survey, run that interview, run that experiment, and then if they all agree, then you pretty much have a pretty good answer, right, as to what's happening. If you support your hypothesis with 3 different methods, that's a pretty strong hypothesis. But if you're only answering it with one method, then it's a little bit weaker, right? Then you gotta really replicate again, which means run the study with different people and try to get the same results. And if you can't replicate, that throws your research into doubt, right? And there's a lot of problems with not replicating in psychological research. Here are some more advantages of the multi-group design besides the ones I was talking about previously. If you have 3 or more levels, you can make more distinct inferences based on your data. For example, attractiveness. If you're hiring someone, is physical attractiveness an advantage, or is physical unattractiveness a disadvantage? Right, so they're basically saying, if you're going for a job and someone perceives you as physically attractive, are you more likely to get the job? And so if we want to test this hypothesis, let's say my hypothesis is that people high on physical attractiveness will get a job if they are comparable with regard to their other qualifications, right? So if everything's equal in terms of qualifications, the person that's judged as more physically attractive will probably get the job over someone judged as not as physically attractive. So it's kind of like a tiebreaker. Now, I don't know what HR people or people doing interviews decide on, right? I mean, do they decide, this person's close, but this person's attractive, so therefore we want them? You know, I mean, there's nothing inherently uh, interesting about this decision. It becomes almost arbitrary. But yet this decision is made many, many times because, when people apply for jobs, you have hundreds of applicants for some jobs. How do you pick them out? Well, you pick out certain resumes, right? Thankfully, pictures are not on resumes, so your picture cannot bias uh, someone's, resume or CV. Although people do have now, LinkedIn and other kinds of social media platforms where they can put pictures up, and there are some hiring people that might check those websites out. But if you just got a regular resume, it doesn't have your picture, so you can't really judge on who you pick to come interview. Now, once you pick your top 10 people or so and you interview them, now you're meeting them in person or you're meeting them via Skype or something else like that, right? And you're deciding who do you pick. Now, these top 10 people are pretty much all qualified because you looked at the resume and you decided these are my top 10 people out of the hundreds of applications I've gotten, and I need to pick one. So they're pretty much all qualified, and you have to make a decision. Now, is attractiveness a part of that decision? I don't make these hiring decisions within the college, so I don't know. But as a researcher, I could find out. And the easiest way to find out is give people a photo with their resume. So you give them the same resumes. You might change the names. You might change the background a little bit. But qualifications would be exactly the same. And then you attach a picture to that resume. And then you have your participants in the experiment rate them on a scale of 1 to 10. How likely are you to hire this person? And you can have females judging females, females judging males, males judging males, males judging females. You can do all that, right? You could divide the pictures into what you call attractive versus unattractive. And you can have those pictures rated. So you can just circulate a picture around with a group of people, pilot test it, and say rate this picture on attractiveness. And then you could divide the pictures up into people that scored high on those ratings of attractiveness, males and females, and people that scored low on those ratings of attractiveness, males and females. So you've had people judge the attractiveness in terms of the pictures, and now you want to see if you get an attractive photo with the same resume, are you going to rate it higher than if you get an unattractive photo with the same resume, right? So qualifications are equal, just attractiveness is being varied. Now, if it's a two-group design, you have attractive versus unattractive. But if you have a three-group design, you can have very attractive, moderately attractive, and unattractive. Or you can extend it anyway. You can make it 4 groups and have moderately unattractive too, right? That's up to you, how you want to rate the pictures, how you want to divvy it up. But having at least 3 groups allows you to make draw more precise conclusions, right? So it might be that if the person is average attractive or very attractive, you rate them highly. And if the person is unattractive, then you rate the person more poorly. So it doesn't matter if you're average or above average, right, in terms of you getting hired, but it does matter if you're below average. Maybe that's one way you want to, sort of look at this, right? Is there a difference between very attractive and averagely attractive in terms of preference for hiring, right? So you could actually compare those. If I have 3 groups, I can actually compare those 2 groups at a time after I test the overall 3 groups to see if there's a difference. And I'll talk about this later in terms of doing the statistics. It's a very easy procedure that I teach in my stats course towards the end of the semester, and it involves analysis of variance. And actually draw the conclusions amongst the 3 or more groups. But that's an advantage of having 3 or more groups because you can make more precise, draw more precise conclusions about the subject matter. Another advantage of having 3 or more groups is you can look for a non-linear relationship. So if you have 2 groups, any kind of relationship you see is linear because you only have 2 points. You have a mean for group 1, which is your first point, and you have a mean for group 2, which is your second point. And any relationship between 2 points has to be a straight line. If I have a nonlinear relationship, I need to have 3 or more levels just to find it, right? So if something's nonlinear, if something's a parabola, right, which is a quadratic function, or if something's an exponential function, you need to have 3 or more levels to find that kind of pattern. The only thing you can find with two levels is a linear relationship. So if you have any belief, and a lot of times you don't know whether your relationship is linear or nonlinear. Sometimes you find that the linear relationship, which is basically a correlation, or just a straight independent groups t-test, that linear relationship is oversimplifying things. That your research is a little more complicated. That you might have a parabolic relationship. For example, here's a situation that you could have a nonlinear relationship. Let's look at the effect of stress on performance. So if you have very low stress, right, and now you're taking the exam, well, generally you're not going to perform as well. And why is that the case if you're very low stress? Because if you're very low stress, you obviously are not treating the exam the way it should be treated. That is very important, that you should be motivated to study, right? Having a little bit of stress is a good thing because it motivates you to do things that you ordinarily wouldn't do, like study for the exam. So if you're stressed about the exam, moderately stressed, that's a good thing. If you're not stressed at all, you're going to kind of blow it off. And I've seen this all the time. I see students that, oh, the exam, especially the first exam of the semester. I'm not saying that anyone in this class is doing that, right? But first exam, you're kind of like, oh, it seems easy, and you kind of, you prepare, but you're not 100% sort of dug in to how to prepare. And then you get that exam and you're like, oh, wow, this is crazy. What happened? Like I should have done something different before. And you kind of regret it. You get a bad score and you're kind of upset. And you obviously email your professor. So I always get lots of emails after the first exam saying, I don't know what happened. Can I pass the course? Can I get an A in the course? And of course I say, yes, you just have to do better. You have to learn from this experience and then prepare more. So if you're not that stressed, you're going to be cavalier. You're going to blow it off. You're going to do pretty poorly. I know this because it happened to me. Like when I first took the SAT, when I first took the GRE, the graduate record exam for admission to graduate school, I was in college and I was kind of like, yeah, this is going to be easy. Like I don't need to prepare for this. This is nothing. I have too many other things to do. I'm not going to really even open the book. So then I showed up at the test and I was like, whoa, wait a minute. Like what happened? Like this is supposed to be easy. And I showed up and I didn't do as well because I wasn't prepared. I thought I was prepared because I underestimated how much I should be putting into it. I was kind of cavalier. I was kind of relaxed. And, I didn't take it seriously enough. And I didn't do well. Obviously, I was 20 years old. When you're 20 years old, you take a lot of things very lightly. And then later on, I studied, I went back, and I did some graduate work as a non-matriculated student, prepared, got ready to go, and then I really put in a lot of work. So I studied for like 3 or 4 to 6 months. And I really sat down and studied. I took it very seriously. I was very stressed. I said, I need to do better. And I did a lot better because I was prepared and I took it seriously. So what I'm getting at is stress is a nonlinear relationship, the effect of stress on performance. Because if you're very low stress, you're going to perform poorly. If you're moderately stressed, you're going to perform optimally, the best, right? So you're going to go from low stress to low performance, moderate stress to high performance. But if you're extremely stressed, once again, you're going to perform poorly because now the stress is interfering with your ability to prepare or to get things done. So now you're just so stressed that you just can't think. You freeze, you panic, and you do poorly. And if you look at that pattern, low stress, low performance, moderate stress, high performance, high stress, low performance, it looks like an upside down U. It looks like an upside down U form, which is a parabola. That is a non-linear relationship. It's a quadratic relationship. You could only see that quadratic relationship emerge if you have 3 or more levels of your independent variable. If I just had low stress versus high stress, you know what I would have found? No relationship. Because low stress was low performance and high stress was low performance. So then if I just looked at those two groups, I would say stress has no influence on performance. It's not linear, it's nothing. There's no relationship there. But once I add the moderate stress condition level, now I see the nonlinear relationship. So a lot of times you're oversimplifying things with just 2 conditions. And if you have 3 or more conditions, you can actually see more complex, more interesting relationships. Another advantage of having 3 or more levels of the independent variable is you can deal with confounds better. Confounds are your alternative explanations. So there are other variables other than the independent variable that can affect the dependent variable. Right? So you have your independent variable, what you're manipulating. You have your dependent variable is what you're measuring. And a confound is something other than your independent variable that can affect your dependent variable. So these are the alternative explanations. And these are bad. These are things you want to control for. Now, ideally, if you run an experimental design with random assignment to conditions, you will deal with most confounds. However, if you can't run an experimental design with random assignment, you're going to have confounds. And one way to sort of deal with those confounds is add another level of the independent variable that addresses that confound. So as I mentioned before, confounds are alternative explanations. For example, female's perception of job type. Would you date someone with this type of job? Well, you can give a bunch of, so you have a bunch of females rate males on a dating site, and the males have different job titles. Okay, some of those job titles are what we call blue collar, which is more of these are people that maybe they work at a shop, or they work as construction, or they work in more of a service like that. So they're the people that don't sit in front of their desk all day. Those are blue collar workers. People are very hard workers, whether they're blue collar or white collar. But there is, a bias among some people differentiating between blue collar and white collar, right? So the blue collar are kind of the people that work not behind a desk. That's probably a oversimplification, but that's something you can sort of think about, right? And then you have white collar, which are people that work in front of the desk. So these are people that work for corporations. These are people that work service-oriented jobs like healthcare, right? Lawyers, your doctors. These people generally get paid more money for the most part, Not always, right? Get paid a little bit more money, right, than blue collar. Um, their jobs are less physically demanding. And once again, this is kind of an oversimplification, but I'm trying to do this to differentiate these groups. So you basically give a description of the job, and it's either blue collar or white collar, and then you ask women, who would you rather date? And you actually give the picture of the guys too. And so let's say you hypothesize that women would prefer to date white collar over blue collar men. Well, men with white collar jobs over blue collar jobs. Let's say that's your hypothesis for whatever reason. That's the way you think. Well, one of the confounds here could be attractiveness, right? So maybe it has nothing to do with blue collar or white collar. Maybe it's the fact that you find this guy attractive, doesn't matter what job he has, and you find this guy not attractive, doesn't matter what job he has, and you pick the guy you find attractive, right? So if I'm just manipulating blue collar versus white collar and putting the pictures up and saying who would you rather date, right? Attractiveness is a big confound. So that two-group design, blue collar versus white collar, is not very effective if attractiveness is influencing the decision. So now we can take that two-group design and make it a four-group design. So we can have attractive white collar, attractive blue collar, average white collar, average blue collar. And so now we're controlling for the effect of attractiveness that we weren't controlling for before by making it from a two-group design to a four-group design and having high and low in terms of attractiveness, or high versus average here. And we can answer that. Now, could there be another confound? Probably, right? And that should be attractiveness. It could be financial, right? Because you have some blue-collar jobs that, these people make more money. For example, an electrician or a plumber would be considered a blue-collar job, but these people can make tons of money doing this, right? I mean, if you're really good and you're in high demand, you're going to make tons of money. You're going to make more money than a lot of white-collar jobs, right? So you can't really just classify, white collar as making more money than blue collar. So you have income now that could be another confound in this decision, right? Is it, are people more likely to date based on income, based on attractiveness, or based on type of job, right? Or they're not likely to date on any of these. Maybe they're just interested in your personality, right? I mean, I don't know what our society has been sort of with these online dating apps and people swipe right and swipe left. They're not really getting it. I mean, they're just judging based on photos. So I'm not quite sure what people are interested in these days, but you can find that out. It's a very complex thing. I mean, you can find out why people prefer certain people to date or are attracted to certain people and not others. If you can sort of design a model for this that is pretty robust, that means it works across various age groups, ethnicities, etc., sexual preferences, gender identities, etc., you can make a ton of money because that's what your dating coaches do and the dating websites propose to do. If you can find that out, no one's really figured this out right now. There's lots of there's variable information. No one exactly knows what different people like, so it's very individualistic, right? But if you can figure that out through research, you're going to be rich. You'll have your own website, your own dating website. You'll make tons of money. So far, no one's been able to do this, but this is a way to deal with those confounds. You turn a two-group design into a four-group design and more effectively deal with those confounds. So let's look at a practice problem with confounds because they're important. An industrial organizational psychologist hypothesized that providing office workers with a gift from the administration will lead employees to feel a sense of reciprocity, right? So they're going to give back, which will increase productivity and elevate mood. To test this hypothesis, the administration provides tap water in the break room for one office, while those in another office have access to cans of Mountain Dew in the mailroom. So this is the idea that if you get a gift from your employer, right, you're going to work harder for them. This is similar to, you get your bonus. So you give a bonus to somebody and you work harder because you got the bonus, right? Um, I never had that before. Like I've had people promise me a bonus and I never got a bonus. When I worked in corporate, it was all a big lie, right? It was your bonus is you get to keep your job. But some people actually gave bonuses. And if you got this bonus, you felt rewarded, valued, and maybe you worked harder for your employer, I should say. So here we're going to give people Mountain Dew. Now, I don't know if people like Mountain Dew, but people might value Mountain Dew better than water, tap water, that is. We're not talking about, Evian bottled water or, Fiji water. We're talking about tap water, non-filtered versus Mountain Dew. So we give them a choice, and we think if more people that get Mountain Dew work harder, then we conclude that Mountain Dew, the reward, right, boosted productivity. So the fact that you got a gift or a reward, a free Mountain Dew or free cans of Mountain Dew in the lunchroom, made you feel better about where you worked and you worked harder. Well, that's pretty simple, right? But there's lots of confounds here. The IV, in this case, is the type of reward you got. And there's two levels, tap water versus Mountain Dew. The confound is something that's manipulated that could influence the dependent variable other than the independent variable, right? So what other variable other than Mountain Dew versus tap water could influence these results? And the answer basically could be caffeine. Caffeine could be influencing the results. Mountain Dew has caffeine. Unfiltered tap water, or even filtered tap water, by that sort of analogy, does not have caffeine. So maybe it's the caffeine in Mountain Dew that give people more energy to work harder. Possibly. Mountain Dew has lots of caffeine. I know that because I used to drink Mountain Dew like crazy. Like when I was a sophomore in college, I was drinking Mountain for some reason. I don't know why. I was drinking Mountain Dew like crazy, and I was drinking Mountain Dew with iced coffee, and just it got kind of nuts. I was having massive amounts of caffeine, and I was working really hard, and I felt fine, right? It wasn't until later in life that I cut down the caffeine because obviously it was too much. Turkish coffee, Mountain Dew. But in this scenario, the energy, the caffeine in the Mountain Dew could energize you, make you work harder. And so it has nothing to do with the reward, whether you got a reward or not. It has a lot to do with the caffeine. So the caffeine here is a major confound. Another confound could be the time of day the gift was given. So if you give it in the morning, maybe people are just more productive in the morning. They're morning people. Personally, I am not a morning person. I am not productive in the morning. I don't like the morning. I don't want to see the morning. I used to get up and go to work I had to be at work at 8 a.m. So I was up at, I don't know what time, 5 or 6. Now, some of you were like, oh, I do that every day. But it's just not for me, right? Like my body does not adjust to being a morning person. I'm a night person all the time. I cannot do the mornings. Thankfully, I have a job that's very flexible and I can schedule night classes. But some people are productive in the morning. And so if you give them the gift in the morning, they're going to be productive in the morning because they're morning people. And then by the afternoon, they kind of they get sluggish. They need like a pick-me-up around 2 o'clock because they're kind of like checking the clock out. And they're just like, I'm so tired, right? And then they need coffee at that point to like kind of re-energize them. Other people are night people and they work better in the afternoon and in the evening. So time of day is another confound with certain people. The time of day increases or decreases their productivity. So as I mentioned before, the multi-group design has a lot of advantages. One is you have a placebo group where they think they're getting the treatment, they're not getting it, right? You can have, in some cases, an empty control group where the group gets no treatment at all. This means they have no expectations on performance. I'm not too thrilled with an empty control group, but you can run it. So in my meditation study, if I had an empty control group, I'd have 10 weeks of people doing nothing. So I'd say, okay, for the next 10 weeks, go home. Act normal, like you normally do. Don't change anything. But I wouldn't actually say that to them. I would say, okay, the meditation group is full. I would kind of lie to them here. And I would say, you guys are on the wait list. So when an opening comes about, I'll email you. So for now, go home and wait. And when there's an opening in the meditation group, I'll get you in, right? So I'm kind of lying to them because they're not going to be in the study. But I don't want to tell them go home and do nothing because that might influence their behavior. They might say, oh, the researcher told me go home and do nothing. So should I read a book? Should I listen to music? Look, telling them you're on the wait list is probably easier because now they can go about their daily life doing what they normally do. And they're the empty control group. Obviously, I would think that meditation would be better than having people go home and do their normal routine. I don't find that question very interesting in terms of which one's better, right? Because obviously meditation is going to be better. So I chose not to use an empty control group. But in some studies, you might want to have a control group where people do nothing. Instead, I used a control group that was more of a comparison to compare my meditation group to a stress management comparison group. But this is a possible option here. You also have to worry about people trying to guess your hypothesis. So if they're in a group, whether they're in the treatment group or in the control group, you have to worry about them trying to figure out the study. If you find someone that is figuring out the study and you think that their responses will be detrimental to your study, you can always remove them. For example, if you go back to, and I keep bringing up this example, the Milgram study, the electrical shock study. If any of the participants thought that the shocks were fake and that this guy, the Confederate, right, this guy's not really hurting, he's not really having a heart problem, he's not really complaining, it's all bogus, it's all an act. If any participants felt that way and you noticed it as a researcher, you would immediately remove them from the study because they're doing something called hypothesis guessing, and that might bias your results. Generally, you don't have too many problems with this unless you're using a lot of deception, right? Unless you're trying to deceive the subject or the participant in a way that prevents them from figuring out your study. If you're not using deception, there's probably no harm in hypothesis guessing. You're probably not having much of that happening to begin with. But if you're using deception, you have to be careful about, are your participants sort of guessing at what the true purpose of the study is? And if they are, that might bias their results. You might have to remove them. That's called hypothesis guessing. And finally, when you're ready to analyze the data, you're no longer going to use a t-test. So a t-test we used to look at the differences between the two groups in the two-group design. We used either a repeated measures t-test, which is called technically a correlated groups t-test, or we used the independent groups t-test, where you have different people in each condition. The correlated groups t-test is when you have the same people in both conditions, so it's a repeated measures design. We're not doing that here because we have more than two groups, so you can no longer use a t-test. You must use a one-way ANOVA. So if you're looking at one independent variable and you have three or more groups or levels, to find the difference between those three groups, you must use a one-way ANOVA. And if you haven't taken stats, I'm teaching it every fall if you're around. Or you can just reach out to me, email me, and ask me about it. I'll be happy to talk to you about stats because this is what I do pretty much all the time. If you have three or more groups, you're going to use the one-way ANOVA. And you're going to see, is there a difference? So the one-way ANOVA says, are the means of the three groups or the three levels the same, or are they not the same? That's all it tells us. Are these three groups the same, or are they not the same? Now, as the researcher, you want those three groups to be not the same. Because if the three groups are the same, then there's no difference between those three groups, and then therefore your research is is garbage, right? It doesn't work. Your idea fails. So you want there to be a difference between these three or more groups. Now, once you get a significant difference through the one-way ANOVA, right, you get a significant one-way ANOVA, which means that the p-value is less than 0.05, which basically says there's less than a 5% probability that you got this result due to luck. That means that the result is generally real. It's due to the effect of the independent variable. So those three groups are different from each other because your independent variable is making them different, which is another way of saying your idea works. Once you get a significant one-way ANOVA, you're going to do post hoc tests or comparisons. So if you have three groups, you're going to compare group 1 with group 2. You're going to compare group 1 with group 3. You're going to compare group 2 with group 3, right? If you have four or more groups, you're going to have more comparisons. Those are called post hoc tests. They occur after you do the ANOVA. So once you have a statistically significant ANOVA, you can then do your post hoc tests. Generally, the way I run them is I use the Tukey honestly significance difference test, the HSD, Tukey HSD test. And that allows me to determine whether individual levels or groups of the independent variable are different from each other. You can also do planned comparisons. So if you do planned comparisons, then you don't do the ANOVA. So before you do the ANOVA, you can test, is group 1 different from group 3? Before you even do the ANOVA. Let's say you're not interested in seeing, is there a difference between these three groups? You're just interested in group 1 or level 1 versus level 3. That would be called a planned comparison. And the advantage of planned comparison is that it's much easier to reject the null hypothesis. So it's much easier to find a significant effect, which is what you want as a researcher. The pitfalls of a planned comparison is, do people actually believe that you did this before the ANOVA, right? So was this your idea all along? Well, if you thought group 1 was different from group 3, why don't you just run a 2-group design with group 1 and group 3, and then call those group 1 and group 2 in the 2-group design? Why run three or four groups if you're only interested in testing these 2 groups? And the answer is, you don't really have a good answer at that point. So my view of planned comparisons is don't run them because other people will criticize you. But planned comparisons or planned contrasts are used by certain researchers, but they have to occur before you run the omnibus ANOVA test. And people like myself are going to be very skeptical of the fact that you're doing planned comparisons without running the ANOVA. Because generally, you think all the groups are different. As a researcher, you think if you have 3 groups, you think they're all different from each other. If you have 4 groups, you think they're all different from each other. As a researcher, you don't have 4 groups and then say, I think that group 1 and group 4 are different, and the rest of them are the same. Because if that was the case, why did you run 4 groups? As a researcher, you generally think all the groups are going to be different. So to run the planned comparison is kind of lying. It's kind of, I would say it's not really, you can't convince me that that's really what you thought in advance, right? Just because the planned comparison gives you more statistical power, it lets you reject the null hypothesis easier. And so I can say, well, you probably ran the post hoc tests and you found no differences. So now you're going to kind of ignore that and say, I didn't run anything. I'm just going to look at group 1 and group 4. And to me, that's kind of suspect, right? That's not good science. People are kind of manipulating the data, massaging the data. I don't like that. So I would advise against these planned comparisons. You probably don't know much about them. I'm just kind of bringing it up. But if you ever read anything about planned comparisons, I would say don't do them. Do the one-way ANOVA. And if you get a significant one-way ANOVA, run the post hoc tests, the Tukey tests. which I run. You can run other ones. There's like 20 of them. But I like to run the Tukey test. Tukey, honestly, significant different test. And this is probably more detailed than you probably wanted to know, but I'm giving it to you anyway. So hopefully you enjoyed the lecture. It was only a short number of slides, but I talked a lot. I got kind of into this. So hope you enjoyed it. Hope I wasn't too boring for you or too convoluted. If you have questions, feel free to email me or come to my office hours. And take care of yourself, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.